To you, dear friend, this is a story about second chances, about two worn-out souls who found in each other what they believed was lost forever. Some folks say the West was won by guns and gold, but I believe it was built by ordinary people who chose kindness over cruelty, who made homes from nothing but sweat prayer and stubborn hope. If you have ever lost someone dear, if you have ever felt alone, even in a crowded room, if you have ever wondered whether your heart might learn to beat again, this story is for you. Pour yourself a cup of coffee, sit a spell. Let me carry you back to Texas, summer of 1887, when the land was parched and the sky stretched on forever, and two strangers met at a forgotten railway stop at the edge of nowhere. There are moments in a life when everything changes, though the one living it does not know it yet. Josiah Westcott had no intention of bringing anyone home that day. He had come to the station for barley and nothing more. 37 years old. 3 years a widower. He had learned to expect nothing from this world except what he could build with his own two hands. Hope was a luxury he could no longer afford. But life, as my grandmother used to say, has a peculiar way of surprising us when we stop looking. Sometimes the greatest blessings arrive disguised as burdens. Sometimes the person you never asked for becomes the person you cannot live without. The last bag of barley landed in the wagon bed with a thud that sent dust swirling into the afternoon light. Josiah wiped his forehead with the back of his hand. His shirt clung to his shoulders, dark with sweat. The August sun had been bearing down since dawn, and the wooden platform of the railway station shimmered in the heat like something not quite real. He reached for his canteen, took a long drink. The water was warm and tasted of leather, but it was wet, and that was enough. The smell of the place hung thick in the still air. Cold smoke from the morning train. Axle grease baking on the iron rails. Pine boards warping under the relentless sun. A horsefly droned past his ear. Somewhere down the track a crow called out once and fell silent. Behind him, the station house sat quiet paint peeling off its clapboard walls in long, tired strips. A single window reflecting the bleached sky. The 10:15 from San Antonio had come and gone hours ago, leaving nothing behind but the stink of engine oil and the memory of its whistle. Nothing and no one. Or so he thought. Mr. Westcott. Josiah turned. Old Orrin Falk stood in the doorway of the station office, his telegraph key silent on the desk behind him. The station master was 70 if he was a day bent like a mesquite branch, but his eyes were sharp as ever. He smelled of pipe tobacco and the peppermint drops he kept in his vest pocket. Orrin. You fixing to head back directly soon as I tie down these bags? Orrin scratched his chin. He had that look, the one he got when he knew something you did not. Well now, I reckon you ain't seen her yet. Josiah's hands paused on the rope. Seen who? The woman. Come in on the morning train. Orrin jerked his thumb toward the far end of the platform. Been sitting there since 8 o'clock. Won't budge. Won't talk to nobody neither. Josiah followed the gesture with his eyes. At first he saw nothing but shadow. The overhang of the station roof cut a dark rectangle against the glare, and his vision took a moment to adjust. Then the shape resolved itself. A woman, sitting on a wooden trunk at the edge of the platform where the boards gave way to dirt and scrub grass. She faced away from him, looking out at the empty tracks that stretched toward the horizon and vanished into the heat shimmer. She was utterly still, and on her lap, held close against her body, the way a mother might hold a child, There was something wrapped in cloth, a book or a ledger of some kind pressed tight to her ribs as if it were the last thing she owned that mattered. "Who is she?" Josiah heard himself ask. "Mail order bride, from what I gather." Orrin spat tobacco juice into the dust. "Fellow named Hudgens was supposed to meet her. You know him. Got that place up past Miller Creek." Josiah knew him. A loud man with soft hands, the kind who smiled too much and meant none of it. He come for her. Oh, he come all right. Orrin's voice carried something hard in it, something that sounded like disgust. Took one look at her. Said she weren't what he ordered. Said he'd found himself a younger option. Then he got back on his horse and rode off without so much as a fare thee well. The words hung in the air like the smell of something burning. Josiah stared at the woman's back, at the rigid line of her spine, at the way she held her head up despite everything, at the way her fingers gripped that cloth-wrapped bundle on her lap like it was the only anchor she had left in this world. She'd been sitting there all this time, all day long. I offered her water, offered her a chair inside where it's cooler. She just shook her head. Orrin lowered his voice, and Josiah could smell the peppermint on his breath. "I tell you, Josiah, I ain't seen nothing like it. What kind of man does that? Orders a woman like she's a piece of furniture from the Sears catalog, then sends her back because she ain't shiny enough." Josiah did not answer. He was already walking. His boots made hollow sounds on the platform boards. Thunk, thunk, thunk. The woman did not turn, did not move. He came around the trunk and stopped a few feet in front of her, blocking the sun. Her face lifted into the sudden shadow. She was not young, not old either. Somewhere in the middle years, where life had started to leave its marks. Brown hair pulled back from a face that might have been pretty once before hardship drew its lines around her mouth and eyes. She wore a dress of faded blue calico, the fabric washed so many times it had gone soft as old paper. Her hands rested on the cloth-wrapped bundle in her lap, fingers laced over it, the knuckles white. She did not speak. Neither did he. The silence stretched between them strange and heavy. A hot wind moved across the platform carrying the smell of sage and dry earth. "Ma'am," his voice came out rough. He cleared his throat. "You need help." Her eyes met his, gray, clear. There was something in them, not defeat exactly, not even sadness, more like a wall. A carefully constructed wall that said, "I have been hurt before, and I will not let you see how much this hurts now." "I am waiting," she said. Her voice was steady. "For the next train. Next train don't come through till Thursday." "I know. That's 4 days. I know." Josiah looked at the trunk beneath her, looked at her empty hands wrapped around that book. Looked at the endless flat nothing that surrounded them on all sides. Brown grass, white sky, not a soul for miles. You got somewhere to go. Family, no. Friends, no. Money. She did not answer, but the faint tightening of her jaw told him everything. He should walk away. He knew that. This was not his problem. He had his own troubles. Drought killing his cattle. Debts piling up. A heart that had stopped feeling anything 3 years ago when they put his wife and son in the ground. He should walk away. "My name is Josiah Westcott," he said instead. "I got a ranch about 12 miles north of here. It ain't much, but there's a roof and 3 meals a day." He paused, took a breath. "I need someone to cook and keep house. The work is honest and the pay is fair." The wall in her eyes flickered. Just for a moment. I am not looking for charity, Mr. Westcott. Didn't offer you none. I'm offering a job." She studied him. Her gaze moved across his face like she was reading a map, searching for the lie, the trap, the hidden cruelty. He let her look. He had nothing to hide. "Why?" she asked finally. "You don't know me, because I know what it feels like to be left behind." He did not say that. He said, "Can you cook?" Something shifted in her expression. The wall cracked just a fraction. Not much, but enough. "Yes," she said, "I can cook." Josiah nodded once. Then he reached down and picked up one end of her trunk. The leather handle was warm from the sun, worn smooth by years of use. "Then let's go." She stood, and as she did, she shifted the cloth-wrapped bundle from her lap and tucked it inside her coat, pressing it against her chest. Close, protected. Whatever was in that wrapping, it was worth more to her than everything in the trunk combined. The wagon lurched over a rut. The woman's shoulder bumped against his, and she pulled away, quick pressing herself against the far edge of the seat. Josiah kept his eyes on the road. The horses plodded on. Dust rose from their hooves in lazy clouds that hung in the still air before settling on everything. The barley bags, the wooden trunk, the faded blue of her dress. Neither of them spoke. Miles of brown grass rolled past. The land here was flat and cracked. The earth split into patterns that looked like the skin of something old and dying. The smell of sage drifted on the hot wind, mixed with the sharper scent of horse sweat and axle grease. A hawk circled overhead, riding the thermals, searching for anything still alive down below. "The creek dried up in June," Josiah said. His voice sounded strange after so much silence. "Ain't rained proper since April." She nodded, said nothing. He pointed toward a cluster of dark shapes in the distance. "Those are my cattle. What's left of them?" The shapes resolved as they drew closer. Thin animals with ribs showing through their hides gathered around a hole in the ground where water should have been. Mud. That was all. Brown mud crusted at the edges, shrinking day by day. The smell hit them as they passed. The sour stink of desperation, of creatures waiting to die. "How do you keep them alive?" she asked. "Haul water from the well. 2 miles there, 2 miles back, twice a day." He flicked the reins. "Well's going dry, too." The wagon crested a low rise and the ranch house came into view. It was smaller than she expected. He could see that in the way her eyes moved across it. The weathered boards gone silver with age. The sagging porch. The windmill standing motionless against the sky. A barn listing slightly to one side. A chicken coop. A clothesline with nothing on it. And on the porch, 2 chairs. One was a rocking chair, full-sized, facing west toward where the sun would set in a few hours. The wood was gray with age, the seat worn smooth from years of use. Beside it, on the dusty floorboards, a smaller chair, child-sized, empty. The woman's gaze lingered there, on that small chair, on the absence it held. Josiah's hands tightened on the reins. He felt her looking. Felt the question forming in the air between them, like something you could almost touch. "Mr. Westcott," she said quietly, "how long have you lived here alone?" His jaw locked. The question sat between them like a stone too heavy to lift. 3 years, 2 months, 11 days. He opened his mouth to say something more, and the windmill groaned. A single long creak of metal on metal. Then silence. The blades had stopped turning. The kitchen smelled of dust and old grease and something else. Something faint and sad. like a room that had forgotten what it was for. Thera stood in the doorway, her trunk still sitting on the porch where Josiah had left it. He had mumbled something about checking on the windmill and disappeared around the side of the house. The screen door had slapped shut behind him, and now she was alone. She stepped inside. Cobwebs hung from the ceiling beams in long, dusty strands. The cast-iron stove squatted against the far wall, cold and dark, its surface coated with a layer of grime that spoke of months without use. On the wooden counter, a coffee pot sat beside a hand-crank grinder, both covered in the same fine dust that covered everything. A row of wooden spoons hung from pegs on the wall, untouched, their handles darkened with age. Thera ran her finger along the edge of the table, drew a line through the dust, looked at the gray on her fingertip. This kitchen had not been used in a long time. Months, maybe longer. She opened the pantry door. The hinges squealed. Inside the shelves held canned beans, dried corn, a sack of flour that had gone hard at the edges, salt pork wrapped in cloth, the fat gone yellow, coffee beans in a tin with a dented lid, the supplies of a man who ate to survive, not to live. She set the cloth-wrapped bundle on the counter, unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a small leather notebook, its cover cracked with age, the pages thick and yellowed, filled with handwriting that was not hers, her grandmother's hand. Recipes for poultices, drawings of plants with their names written underneath in faded ink, remedies for fever, for cough, for wounds that would not close. This notebook was the only thing she had left of the woman who had raised her after her parents died. The only proof that someone had once loved her enough to teach her something worth knowing. She wrapped it again, placed it on the highest shelf, away from the grease and the dust. Safe. Then she found matches above the stove and kindling in a box beside it. Her hands moved without thinking. Crumpling newspaper, stacking thin sticks, striking the match. The sulfur smell bit her nose. The flame caught. Smoke curled up into the flue. The stove began to warm. She pumped water from the hand pump at the sink. The first few strokes brought nothing but air and a grinding sound that set her teeth on edge. Then water coughed out rust colored at first, then clear enough. She filled a pot, set it on the stove to heat. She worked in silence. Beans into a pot with salt pork and a little molasses she found in the back of the pantry, the jar sticky, the lid crusted shut until she pried it loose with a knife. Cornmeal mixed with water and a pinch of salt shaped into rounds with her palms pressed flat, laid into a cast-iron skillet she had scrubbed clean with sand and elbow grease. Coffee beans fed into the grinder, the handle turning with a sound like bones, cracking, the smell rising up dark and bitter and familiar. The kitchen filled with warmth, with the smell of food cooking, beans bubbling, cornbread crisping, coffee steaming, with something that had been missing from this house for longer than she could guess. Footsteps on the porch. The screen door opened. Josiah stood in the doorway, his hands black with grease, his shirt dark with sweat. He looked at the stove, at the steam rising from the pots, at her. His face did something strange. A flicker gone before she could name it. Windmill gear was stuck, he said. Fixed it. Good. She wiped her hands on a cloth she had found in a drawer. Supper's ready. He washed at the pump outside. She heard the splash of water, the scrubbing of hands, the sound of him clearing his throat. When he came back in, his face was wet, his hair pushed back from his forehead, dripping onto the collar of his shirt. They sat across from each other at the table. Thera set down the plates. Beans still steaming the molasses, giving them a dark shine. 2 rounds of cornbread golden brown from the skillet, the edges crisp. She poured coffee into tin cups, the liquid black and strong, steam rising in the lamplight. Josiah looked at the food, then at her. "I reckon we ought to say grace," he said quietly. Thera folded her hands, bowed her head. Josiah's voice was rough, halting, like a man speaking a language he had not used in a long time. "Lord, we thank you for this food, for the hands that prepared it, for," he paused, swallowed, "for your mercies which we don't always deserve." "Amen." "Amen," Thera whispered. He picked up his fork, looked at the cornbread. His hand stopped. Something moved across his face. Quick. Gone. Almost before she saw it. He stared at the bread like it was something from another life. His jaw tightened. The fork trembled just slightly between his fingers. "Mr. Westcott." He blinked. The fork shook again. "It's round," he said. His voice was strange, thick. Thera looked at the cornbread. "I always make it round. My mother taught me that way, back when I was just a girl. She made it round, too." The words fell into the silence like stones into still water. Thera did not ask who. She did not need to. Josiah lifted the fork, cut into the cornbread. The inside was yellow and soft, still warm. He took a bite, chewed slowly. The taste of corn and salt, and the faint sweetness of the molasses from the beans. He swallowed. "It's good," he said. "Thank you kindly." They ate without speaking. The only sounds were the scrape of forks on tin, the creak of the house settling in the cooling air, the distant lowing of cattle somewhere in the dark. The kerosene lamp flickered between them, casting shadows that jumped and swayed on the walls. When the plates were empty, Josiah showed her to the small room at the end of the hall. A narrow bed with a quilt folded at the foot. Faded colors. Hand-stitched squares. The work of someone who had taken care with every stitch. A washstand with a chipped basin. A window that looked out on nothing but darkness and the faint shapes of mesquite trees against the stars. The walls were bare except for a single nail where something had once hung. A picture, maybe, or a sampler, something that had mattered to someone. "There's clean sheets in the chest," Josiah said from the doorway. His hand gripped the frame, the knuckles white. "Breakfast is at 5. He turned to go. "Mr. Westcott." He paused but did not turn around. "Thank you," Thera said, "for bringing me here, for the work." A long moment passed. His back was to her, his shoulders a dark shape against the lamplight from the hall. She could hear him breathing. Slow, deliberate, the breath of a man holding something in. "Don't thank me yet," he said. "This land takes more than it gives." He walked away. His boots sounded on the floorboards, then on the porch. The screen door opened and closed with a slap. Thera sat on the edge of the bed. The mattress was thin, stuffed with corn husks that rustled beneath her weight like whispers. She looked around the room, at the small space, at the nail on the wall, at the window that showed nothing but night. The quilt smelled of cedar and something else, lavender maybe, faint, almost gone. Through the thin walls she could hear him, footsteps on the porch, back and forth, the creak of boards under his weight, the rhythm of a man who could not rest. She lay down, pulled the quilt over her shoulders, closed her eyes. The footsteps continued. 1 hour, 2. The moon rose and crossed the window and sank again. Sometime deep in the night, they stopped. Thera listened to the silence, to the crickets, to the call of an owl somewhere in the darkness, to her own breathing in the stillness of this strange room that smelled of lavender and loss. And then soft muffled coming from somewhere outside, a sound, low, broken. The sound of a man who had held everything in for too long, finally letting a piece of it escape into the darkness where he thought no one could hear. Thera lay very still. She did not go to him. She knew somehow that he would not want her to, but she did not sleep either. Not for a long, long time. 4 a.m, the sky still black outside the window. Josiah pulled on his boots in the dark, the leather stiff and cold against his feet. His muscles ached from yesterday's work, hauling water, mending fence, checking on cattle that grew thinner by the day. The same work he had done every day for 3 years. The same emptiness waiting for him in the kitchen. He walked down the hall. The floorboards creaked under his weight, pushed open the door to the main room, and stopped. Light, warm and yellow, spilling from the kitchen doorway. The smell of coffee, strong black bitter in the best way. Bacon crackling in a pan, the fat popping and hissing. The yeasty scent of biscuits in the oven. Thera stood at the stove, her back to him. She had pinned her hair up, exposing the pale curve of her neck. A worn apron, one he did not recognize must have been in her trunk, was tied at her waist. She moved with quiet efficiency, flipping bacon with a long fork, checking the biscuits through the oven door. The lamplight caught the side of her face, and he noticed for the first time the faint shadow beneath her eyes. She had not slept well either. "You're up early," he said. She did not turn. "So are you." He sat at the table. A plate appeared in front of him. Bacon, the edges crisp and brown. Eggs fried in the bacon, greased the yolk still soft. Biscuits that steamed when he broke them open, the inside white and fluffy. A cup of coffee, dark as night. She sat across from him with her own plate, her portion smaller than his. He noticed that too, but said nothing. He ate. The bacon was salty and perfect, the eggs rich. The biscuits melted on his tongue. He could not remember the last time he had tasted food this good. For 3 years he had eaten cold beans from the canned jerky, chewed standing-up coffee so old the grounds had turned to powder. He had forgotten that food could be more than fuel, that it could be something close to kindness. When the plates were empty, Josiah pushed back his chair. "I'm going to start on the dam today," he said. "There's a low spot about a mile east where the land dips between 2 rises. If I can build up the banks, they'll catch the runoff when the rains come." He stopped, swallowed the word if. Might could save what's left of the herd. Thera looked at him. "How long will it take? Weeks? Maybe longer. Depends on how fast I can dig." She stood, gathered the plates, set them in the basin with a clatter of tin. "I'll come with you." "That ain't necessary. The house can wait." She untied her apron, hung it on the peg by the door. Her movements were quick, certain. "Show me where to dig." He looked at her for a long moment. Something in her voice told him this was not about helping. Not exactly. There was an edge underneath it. A need to prove that she was earning her keep, that she owed nothing, that the roof over her head and the food on her plate were paid for in full by the sweat of her own back. He did not argue. He simply said, "Bring water. It's going to be a long day." The sun rose red over the eastern hills. They walked in silence. Josiah carrying the pickaxe over his shoulder, the weight familiar against his collarbone. Thera walked beside him with a shovel and a burlap sack. Biscuits wrapped in cloth. A canteen of water. The tin cup they would share. She carried the shovel the way a soldier carries a rifle, upright against her shoulder, the handle gripped firm like she had already decided she would not put it down until the work was done, or her body gave out, whichever came first. The grass crunched beneath their boots, dry and brittle, breaking into dust with each step. The air smelled of sage and the faint sweetness of decay from somewhere far off. A jackrabbit bolted from behind a clump of brush, zigzagging across the flat with long, desperate leaps before vanishing into the brown distance. Neither of them flinched. They were both too tired for surprise. The low spot sat at the base of two gentle slopes, maybe a quarter-mile across. Erosion had carved a shallow bowl in the earth over the years, and a trickle of water barely more than a seep, a dark stain on the rocks, oozed from between the stones at the far end. The water smelled faintly of iron and wet stone. It pooled in a space no bigger than a dinner plate before the sun drank it up. "If I build the banks up here and here," Josiah said, pointing with the pickaxe, "the water's got nowhere to go but down into the basin. When the rains come, it'll collect. Form a pond deep enough to last." Thera studied the terrain. Her eyes moved across the slopes, the rocks, the pathetic trickle of water that barely wet the ground before the sun swallowed it whole. She walked to the far end, knelt, touched the damp stone where the seep emerged, brought her fingers to her nose, smelled the mineral tang, looked back at the basin with the eyes of a woman who was already calculating the work ahead, measuring it against what her body could do. How deep does it need to be? Deep enough to last through a dry spell. 4 feet, maybe 5. She looked at the expanse of hard-packed earth, at the single pickaxe, at the one shovel, at the two of them standing there against an entire landscape that seemed determined to die. "Then, I reckon we best get started," she said. The first hour was the hardest. Josiah swung the pickaxe in steady rhythm. The blade bit into the earth, loosened chunks of clay and stone. The impact jarred up through his arms, into his shoulders, down his spine. Behind him, Thera shoveled the debris into a pile, then carried it to the edge of the basin where the banks would rise. She lifted each load like it weighed nothing, but he could see the cords in her neck straining, could see the way she set her jaw with each lift. The sun climbed. The air grew thick and still, heavy as a wool blanket. Sweat soaked through Josiah's shirt, dripped from his chin, fell onto the dry ground where it disappeared like it had never been. He glanced back at Thera. Her dress was dark with moisture clinging to her back. Tendrils of hair had escaped her pins and stuck to her forehead in wet strands. Her face was flushed red. Her breath came in short, harsh gasps. A line of sweat traced the curve of her jaw and dripped onto the collar of her dress, leaving a dark stain that spread with each passing minute. But she did not stop. Scoop, lift, carry, dump, return. Scoop, lift, carry, dump, return. The rhythm never broke. "You don't have to do this," Josiah said. She drove the shovel into the dirt, leaned on the handle. Her chest heaved beneath the sweat-soaked fabric of her dress. Her knuckles were white against the wood. "Neither do you," she said. "But here we are." He turned back to the pickaxe. The days that followed fell into a rhythm. Up before dawn. Coffee and biscuits in the lamplight. The walk to the dig site as the sun cracked the horizon. Work through the morning heat. Rest beneath the oak tree when the sun sat directly overhead. Work again until the shadows grew long and the air began to cool. Then the slow walk back, muscles aching, skin burned, hands raw. The dam grew inch by inch, foot by foot. Thera never complained. She matched him shovel for shovel, hour for hour. When her blisters broke open, she wrapped them in cloth torn from an old petticoat and kept going. Josiah found himself watching her when she did not notice. The way she wiped the sweat from her brow with the back of her wrist. The way she paused sometimes to look out at the horizon, her eyes distant, searching for something he could not name. The way she hummed under her breath while working so soft he could barely hear it. A melody he did not recognize, something slow and sad that seemed to rise out of her without her knowing. He did not know what to make of her. He did not know what to make of himself. The evenings were different. After supper, when the dishes were washed and put away, they would sit in the main room. The cast iron stove glowed with coals, throwing warmth into the cooling night. Thera had found a sewing basket and mended clothes that had gone too long without attention. Josiah sat across from her in the old armchair, a book open in his lap, the same book he had been reading for 3 years. He never got past page 47. They did not speak much during these evenings, but the silence between them had changed. It was no longer the silence of two strangers sharing a roof. It was becoming the silence of two people who did not need words to fill every space, and that Josiah thought was perhaps more dangerous than any conversation they might have had. Midday. The oak tree again. They sat in the shade, their backs against the rough bark. The heat pressed down from above like a hand trying to flatten them into the earth. Thera had brought the biscuits in the canteen. They passed the water back and forth, drinking in small sips to make it last. "Where are you from?" Josiah asked. The question came out before he could think to stop it. Thera wiped her mouth with the back of her hand. A streak of dirt ran across her chin. Pennsylvania. A town called Scranton. Coal country. Nothing like this. No, nothing like this. She looked out at the brown landscape, so different from anything she had known. The vastness of it seemed to swallow her gaze. In Scranton, there were hills everywhere. Green hills with trees so thick you couldn't see through them. Streams that never dried up. Rain that came so often folks complained about it. "Why did you leave?" She was quiet for a long moment. Her fingers picked at a loose thread on her sleeve, winding it around and around. The thread tightened until the tip of her finger went white. "I was a maid," she said finally. "In a big house. The family that owned the mine. The Harringtons. I worked there for 12 years. Since I was 16. Started in the kitchen. Scrubbing pots. Hauling water for the laundry. By the end, I was keeping the whole house. Managing the accounts. Ordering the supplies. Mrs. Harrington trusted me with everything." She paused. A mockingbird called from the top of the oak tree. 3 notes. Then silence. When the mother passed on, the son inherited everything. He had notions about what else I ought to do for my wages. Josiah's jaw tightened. His hands curled into fists against his thighs. The knuckles went white beneath the dirt. "I left that very night. Didn't pack a bag. Didn't take a reference. Just walked out the back door and kept walking until I reached the train station. Took a train to Philadelphia. Saw an advertisement in the paper." She smiled, but there was no humor in it. No warmth. Just the memory of desperation dressed up as opportunity. Mail-order brides wanted for the Western Territories. Room and board guaranteed. A chance to start fresh. And you believed it. I had nothing else left to believe in. The words hung between them like smoke. Heavy. Acrid. The kind that gets in your eyes and won't let go. Josiah looked at his hands. Calloused. Dirt caked. the nails broken and black with grime. Hands that had built fences and dug graves and held a dying child. Hands that had not held another person in 3 years. My wife's name was Luella, he said. Thera went still beside him. Even her breathing seemed to stop. We met at a church social in Austin. I was 22. She was 19. Prettiest girl I ever saw. Dark hair, green eyes, a laugh that made you feel like everything was right with the world. The kind of laugh that filled a room, made strangers smile, made you want to say something funny just to hear it again. He picked up a stick, drew a line in the dust, then another, cross-hatching the dry earth with marks that meant nothing. Her father didn't approve, said I had nothing to offer. He was right too. I was just a ranch hand then, working somebody else's cattle for $30 a month. But she married you anyway. She said she'd rather be poor with me than rich with anyone else. The stick snapped between his fingers. The sound was sharp in the still air. Turned out she got both. Poor and alone. You weren't alone. You had each other. For a while. He threw the broken stick away, watched it land in the dust, watched an ant begin to climb it almost immediately, because that is what small creatures do. They climb whatever is in front of them without asking why. The fever came through in the fall of '84. Took half the county. Took her. Took our boy. How old was he 4? Josiah's voice cracked on the word like a dry branch under a heavy boot. He cleared his throat, but the crack stayed. Lived there in his voice like a fault line that would never fully close. His name was Micah. He wanted to be a cowboy. Used to follow me around with a stick for a gun, saying, "Bang, bang, pow, you're dead." I'd fall down in the dirt, and he'd climb on top of me and declare himself the sheriff of the whole territory. Then he'd ask for a biscuit. The ghost of a smile crossed his face and vanished. Thera said nothing. She did not offer comfort or empty words or any of the useless phrases people say when someone tells them about the worst thing that has ever happened to them. She did not say, "I'm sorry," or "he's in a better place," or "time heals all wounds." She reached over and placed her hand on his arm, just for a moment, just long enough for him to feel the warmth of her palm through his sleeve, the pressure of her fingers, the steadiness of them. Then she pulled it back. "We should get back to work," she said. Josiah nodded, rose to his feet. His legs ached, his back screamed. They walked back to the dig site in silence. But something had shifted between them. The distance had shrunk. The air between them felt different now. Smaller, warmer, like a room where someone had just lit a candle. Late afternoon, the shadows growing long across the dry earth. The light turning gold and amber, the kind of light that made even this dying land look beautiful for a few minutes before the sun gave up and dropped below the horizon. Thera drove her shovel into the ground, lifted. Her foot slipped on a patch of loose clay. She stumbled forward, arms pinwheeling, and went down hard into the mud at the bottom of the shallow pit. She sat there at the bottom of the dig, covered in brown muck from waist to boots. Her hair had come completely undone, hanging in wet ropes around her face. A streak of dirt ran across her cheek like war paint. Her dress, already stained beyond any hope of saving, was now plastered to her legs with a thick layer of clay that was already beginning to dry and crack at the edges. Josiah stared. And then a sound came out of him. Rough, rusty, unfamiliar. like a door that had not been opened in years, its hinges grinding against 3 seasons of rust and neglect. It took him a moment to realize he was laughing. The sound surprised him as much as it surprised her. He had forgotten what his own laughter sounded like. Thera looked up at him. Her eyes went wide, shocked. Not at the fall, at the sound coming out of him. "Are you laughing at me, Mr. Westcott?" "No, ma'am." He reached down, offered his hand. His shoulders shook. "I wouldn't dare." She took it. Her grip was strong, her fingers slick with mud. He pulled her to her feet. She came up heavy with clay, her boots making a sucking sound as they released from the muck. That was when he saw her palms. The skin was raw and red, angry as a burn. Blisters had formed across the base of her fingers, then broken open. Weeping, clear fluid. Fresh blood mixed with the dirt and mud running down her wrists in thin lines that looked like the branches of a tree drawn in red ink. The laughter died in his throat. Gone. Like it had never been. "Why didn't you say something?" His voice came out sharper than he intended. "It's nothing. It ain't nothing." He held her hands in his, turning them over gently. The wounds were inflamed, the edges white and puckered. Some of the blisters were old, partially healed, calloused at the rims. Others were fresh. They had been building for days. "You've been working like this all day, all week. The work needed doing." He looked at her face, at the stubborn set of her jaw, at the gray eyes that refused to show pain even now. This woman who would rather bleed in silence than admit she needed help, who would rather destroy her own hands than accept the possibility that someone might care enough to stop her, who kept the world at arm's length because every time she had let someone close, they had either used her or abandoned her, or both. "Wait here," he said. He walked back to where they had left their supplies. In the burlap sack beneath the remaining biscuits was a small tin. The salve Luella used to make from lard and dried calendula, and a bit of beeswax. He had kept making it after she died, though he could not have said why. Maybe because his hands remembered the motions, even when his heart had forgotten the reason. Maybe because the smell of it brought her back. He returned to Thera. Opened the tin. The smell rose up. Familiar. Achingly so. "Give me your hands." She hesitated. Something flickered behind her eyes. Resistance. The old reflex. That wall she had built so carefully, brick by brick, year by year in all the houses where she had served and been invisible. "I don't need to be tended to like a child." Josiah did not move, did not withdraw the tin. He simply stood there, waiting the salve open in his palm. Patient. The way you wait for a spooked horse to come to you, knowing that any sudden move will send it running. "It ain't charity," he said quietly. "It's sense. Can't dig with hands that don't work." She looked at him. A long moment passed. The wind moved through the dry grass around them, carrying the faint smell of sage and dust. Somewhere far off a quail called its 2-note song. The sun was dropping toward the western hills, stretching their shadows out long and thin across the cracked earth. And then something in her shifted. A small surrender. Not of pride exactly, but of the exhausting effort it took to hold everyone at arm's length every hour of every day. The weight of that wall. The cost of carrying it. She extended her hands, palms up. He dipped his fingers into the salve, began to work it into her wounds, gently, carefully. The medicine was cool against her heated skin. She flinched once. A quick intake of breath, but did not pull away. He worked the salve into each broken blister, each raw patch, each crack where the skin had split and bled. His hands were large and rough, but they moved across her wounds with a tenderness that seemed to belong to someone he had been a long time ago. "This will help," he said. "Keep the infection out." "Thank you." He looked up. Their faces were close enough to see the flecks of gold in her gray eyes, close enough to feel her breath warm on his cheek. The moment stretched. The air between them grew warm and still and heavy with something neither of them was ready to name. And then a sound. Hoofbeats. Coming fast from the direction of the main road, drumming against the hard-packed earth like thunder. Josiah released her hands, stepped back, turned toward the noise. The air rushed into the space between them like water filling a hole. 3 riders were approaching from the south. They moved at an easy pace, in no particular hurry. Their horses fresh and well-fed, the coats gleaming with health that seemed obscene in a land where everything else was starving. As they drew closer, Josiah could make out details. Fine saddles with silver conchos, clean clothes, not a speck of dust. Guns on their hips, the holsters oiled and supple. The lead rider was a big man on a black stallion. He wore a gray suit despite the heat, a gold watch chain glinting against his vest. His face was broad and red, the face of a man who ate well and often. A thick mustache covered his upper lip, waxed at the ends to sharp points that curled upward like the horns of something mean. Harlan Briggs. Josiah set down the pickaxe, wiped his hands on his trousers. "Stay here," he said to Thera. "Josiah, stay here." He walked toward the riders. They had stopped at the edge of the work site, their horses stamping and snorting, tossing their heads against the flies. Briggs sat easy in his saddle, looking down at Josiah with a smile that was warm on the surface and hollow underneath, like honey poured over something rotten. "Westcott." His voice was smooth, friendly, wrong. "Working hard, I see. Briggs. Quite the project you got going here." Briggs's gaze swept across the dam, the basin, the small pool of collected water that glinted weakly in the afternoon light. "Must have been at it for weeks. What do you want?" Briggs laughed, a soft, oily sound. "Straight to business. I always did like that about you, Westcott. No wasted words." He shifted in his saddle, the leather creaking. "I heard tell about your little dam. Thought I'd ride on over and see it for myself. You've seen it. Now you can go. In a minute. In a minute." Briggs's smile faded, the mask slipping. "We need to palaver first." He dismounted. His boots polished black leather that probably cost more than Josiah made in 3 months crunched on the dry ground. The 2 men with him stayed mounted, hands resting near their holsters, their eyes flat and watchful, the eyes of men who were paid to watch and wait and do what they were told. "This water you're collecting." Briggs walked closer. His shadow fell across Josiah, long and dark in the slanting light. "You know where it comes from, the seep. And where does the seep come from?" Briggs stepped closer still. Josiah could smell him now. Pomade and cigars and something sour underneath. "It comes from runoff. Runoff that used to flow downhill. Downhill onto my property. That runoff dried up 2 months ago because there ain't been no rain. But when the rain comes, and it will come sooner or later, that water belongs to me." Briggs's voice hardened, the friendly tone dropping away like a shed skin. "You're stealing my water, Westcott." Josiah felt the anger rise in his chest. hot and tight. He pushed it down, kept his voice level. That water don't belong to you. It don't belong to anyone. It comes from the hills, flows through the land, and goes where it goes. You don't own the rain, Briggs. I own the land it falls on. Not this land. They stood face to face, close enough that Josiah could smell the tobacco on Briggs's breath, close enough to see the broken veins across his nose, close enough to see the sweat beating at his temples despite the expensive suit. I'm going to make this real simple, Briggs said. I want to buy your ranch. All of it. The house, the cattle, the land. He paused, letting the words hang. And this here dam. I'm prepared to offer you $3,000. Cash money. You can take it and start over somewhere else. California, maybe. I hear the weather's right pleasant out that way. $3,000. It was more money than Josiah had seen in his entire life. More than the ranch was worth, especially now. No, he said. Briggs's eyebrows rose. No, I was born on this land. My father built that house with his own 2 hands. My wife is buried here. My son is buried here. Josiah's voice was steady, though his heart pounded against his ribs. I ain't leaving. That's sentiment talking. I'm offering you a future. I got a future right here. Briggs's jaw tightened. The friendly mask fell away completely now, revealing something harder underneath, something cold and mean. You're making a mistake, Westcott. Maybe so. But it's my mistake to make. The silence stretched between them. The horses shifted. One of Briggs's men spat tobacco juice into the dust. A fly buzzed between them, circled once, and disappeared. And then Briggs's eyes moved past Josiah to where Thera stood watching from the edge of the dig site, the shovel still in her hands, held upright like a weapon she was not sure she would need, but was ready to use. Well, well. He walked toward her, ignoring Josiah's stiffening posture. Who do we have here? Thera did not move, did not speak. She held the shovel in front of her knuckles, white around the handle. Briggs stopped in front of her, looked her up and down with an appraising gaze that made Josiah's fists clench so tight his knuckles cracked. Where'd you come from, sweetheart? I don't recall seeing you in town. His smile widened, showing teeth. Let me guess. Ordered from a catalog. Westcott finally got tired of keeping his own company. That's enough. Josiah's voice was low. Dangerous. He did not recognize the sound of it. Briggs turned. Just making conversation, Westcott. No need to get your hackles up. Make it somewhere else. Touchy. Briggs laughed. She must be something special, this one. He looked at Thera again. What's your name, honey? Her name ain't none of your concern. Josiah stepped between them. His hand shook with the effort of keeping it at his side. She's family, and you need to leave. Now. Family. Briggs's eyebrows rose high on his forehead. I didn't know you had any family left, Westcott. Thought the fever took care of that. The words hit like a fist to the gut. Josiah felt the blood drain from his face. His vision narrowed to a point. The world went quiet except for the sound of his own pulse hammering in his ears. Get off my land. The 2 men stared at each other. Something passed between them. A recognition, perhaps, of lines drawn and boundaries tested, of wars declared without a single shot fired. Briggs stepped back, raised his hands in mock surrender. All right. I can see you ain't in a negotiating mood today. He walked back to his horse, mounted with the easy grace of a man who had spent his whole life in the saddle. "But you think about my offer, Westcott. $3,000. It's a generous price for a dying ranch and a stubborn fool." "The ranch ain't dying. Not yet." Briggs gathered his reins. His eyes glittered in the afternoon light. But things change. Droughts get worse. Cattle die. Accidents happen. He let the threat hang unfinished. There's all kinds of ways to make a man change his mind. He wheeled his horse. His men fell in behind him. They rode off the way they had come, leaving nothing behind but hoof prints in the dust and the smell of horses and expensive tobacco. But just before the riders crested the ridge and disappeared, Josiah saw something he had not expected. Briggs reined up for a moment and turned in his saddle, not toward Josiah, toward the land, the cracked earth, the dying grass. And the expression on his face was not smugness. It was something rawer. The face of a man staring at a nightmare he had lived through once before and would do anything to keep from living through again. Then he was gone. Josiah watched the dust settle. His heart pounded against his ribs like a trapped animal. Thera came to stand beside him. Her face was pale beneath the sunburn. "He'll come back, won't he?" "Yes." "What will you do?" Josiah did not answer. He looked down at his hands, empty, calloused, shaking slightly. That evening, as the sun bled red across the horizon and the shadows pooled like dark water around the base of the porch, Orrin Falk rode up on his old mule. He had come to bring a telegram about cattle prices falling, but he stayed long enough to drink a cup of Thera's coffee and share what he knew. Briggs lost his own place, once Orrin said. His voice was low. "Careful. The way a man speaks when he is telling you something important that he wants you to remember. Back in '68, drought took everything. He was young then, had a wife and a baby on the way. Sold the land for almost nothing to a speculator from back east. Wife left him after that. Took the child with her." Orrin stared into his coffee. The steam curled up between his weathered fingers. He built himself back up from nothing. Took him 15 years. And every piece of land he bought after that, every ranch he swallowed up, every family he pushed off their property. He paused, looked up. His old eyes were steady and sad. It was because he was terrified of being that broke, that helpless, that small ever again. "He's afraid," Thera said quietly from the doorway. Orrin nodded. "Afraid is worse than mean. A mean man you can predict. A scared man will burn down the whole world just to feel warm." He finished his coffee, mounted his mule, tipped his hat. "Watch yourselves," he said. And then he rode off into the dusk. That night, Josiah lay in his bed staring at the ceiling. The house was silent except for the usual sounds. The settling of wood, the scratch of a branch against the window, the distant calling of coyotes somewhere out on the flats, their voices rising and falling like a congregation of the damned singing hymns to a moon that did not care. And then another sound, one he had not heard in months. Horses, distant but unmistakable, moving slowly along the ridge that marked the boundary between his land and Briggs's property. The rhythm of the hoofbeats was deliberate, not the careless gait of a cowhand riding home after dark. This was the pace of someone watching, measuring, making a point. He went to the window, looked out. Moonlight, empty fields, silence. The grass silver under the half moon. The dark line of the ridge cutting across the sky like a scar. But he knew. Someone was watching. He stood there until the sound faded, until there was nothing left but the wind and the dark and the feeling that something was coming, something he could not stop, something that would test everything he had left. In the room down the hall, Thera lay awake too. She had heard the horses. She had heard Josiah's footsteps cross to the window and stop. She had heard the silence that followed, heavy with all the things that neither of them could say. She pressed her hand against the spot beneath her pillow where she had tucked her grandmother's notebook. The leather was warm from her body heat. The pages crinkled faintly under her fingers. She thought of the woman who had written those pages. The grandmother who had taken in a 7-year-old orphan and taught her the names of every healing plant that grew in the hills behind their house, who had said to her once in that quiet, steady voice, "You don't need anyone to save you, child, but needing and wanting ain't the same thing. And there ain't no shame in letting someone walk beside you on a hard road." Thera closed her eyes. The horses were gone now. The night was still. The house creaked and settled around her like an old man easing into a chair. But sleep did not come. Because at dawn, when Josiah walked out to check the herd, he would find the first cow lying dead behind the barn. Eyes open and glazed, staring at nothing. Tongue swollen black and crusted with dirt. Flies already gathering in a dark buzzing cloud that rose and fell and rose again. And everything would begin to change. The first cow lay behind the barn like something discarded. On her side in the dust legs, stiff eyes open and glazed, staring at a sky that offered nothing. Her tongue hung from her mouth, swollen and black, crusted with dirt. Flies had already found her. A dark, buzzing cloud that rose when Josiah approached, then settled again, patient, knowing the meal would still be there when the intruder left. He stood over the body for a long time. His hands hung at his sides. His mind was empty, scraped clean like a bone left in the sun. Then he walked to the shed, got the shovel, started digging. By noon, 2 more were dead. The herd had gathered around the water trough, but the trough was empty. The well had given up its last bucket that morning. Brown water, more mud than liquid, smelling of rot and iron and the deep, sick scent of earth that has been drained of everything it had to give. Josiah had poured it into the trough anyway, watched the cattle fight over it, shoving and lowing, lapping at the sludge with desperate tongues, their ribs pressing against their hides like fingers trying to push through a glove. It was not enough. It would never be enough. He dragged the third carcass to the pit he had dug behind the barn. The animal was heavy, maybe 600 pounds of dead weight. Josiah's arms screamed as he hauled it by the hind legs through the dust. The smell filled his nose and his mouth and the back of his throat. Blood and bile, and the first sour hint of rot. His boots slipped on a patch of loose earth. His grip failed. He went down backward, landing hard on his tailbone. The dead cow's legs still clutched in his hands. He lay there in the dirt. The sky above was white and empty. The sun beat down without mercy. Flies buzzed around his head, landed on his face, crawled across his lips. His shirt was soaked through with sweat plastered to his skin. His trousers were caked with mud and worse. He could feel the grit between his teeth, taste the dust on his tongue. "Get up," he told himself. "Get up." His body did not move. The smell of the dead cow filled his nose. The buzzing of the flies filled his ears. The white sky filled his eyes. And in that moment, lying in the dirt beside something that had died because he could not save it, Josiah Westcott felt the full weight of every loss he had ever carried settle onto his chest like a stone too heavy to push away. Get up. He could not. Thera found him an hour later, still lying beside the carcass. She did not speak. She did not cry out or ask what happened or say any of the things a person might say when they find a man lying in the dirt next to a dead animal. She simply knelt beside him, slipped her arm under his shoulders, and helped him to his feet. His legs shook. His head swam. He leaned on her more than he wanted to admit, more than his pride could stand. But she did not buckle under his weight. She held him steady, her arm firm around his back, her hand gripping his shirt, and she walked him toward the house, one step at a time, without saying a word. Inside, Josiah stopped in front of the fireplace. Above the mantel, mounted on wooden pegs worn smooth with age, hung his Winchester rifle. It had been his father's before him. He had not touched it in 3 years. Not since the day he had considered using it on himself and decided he was too much of a coward even for that. He reached up. His fingers brushed the stock. Cool, smooth, familiar. Don't. He turned. Thera stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the bright rectangle of light from outside. Don't, she said again. That's what he wants. He wants you to do something foolish. Something he can use against you. He threatened us. He threatened with words. Words ain't bullets. Josiah's hand hovered near the rifle. The wood grain pressed against his fingertips. He could feel the ghost of his father's grip in the worn places. Could feel the weight of every decision that had ever been made with this weapon, and every decision that had been avoided by putting it back. My father told me once, he said slowly, that a man who picks up a gun better be ready to use it, and a man who uses it better be ready to live with what comes after. Are you ready? The question hung in the air. Josiah closed his eyes, saw Luella's face, Micah's grin, the two graves on the hillside, side by side, marked with wooden crosses he had carved with his own hands during the worst week of his life. No, he said, I ain't. His hand fell away from the rifle. He walked past Thera out of the house back toward the dig site. After a moment, he heard her footsteps following. They worked until dark. Neither spoke of Briggs. Neither spoke of the rifle. On their way back to the ranch that evening, as the last copper light faded from the sky, they came upon a small wagon stopped at the side of the road. A woman Thera did not know stood beside it, her face white with panic. In her arms she held a child, a girl of perhaps 3 years, limp as a rag doll, her skin flushed scarlet, her breath coming in shallow gasps that rattled in her tiny chest. Please, the woman said. Her voice was raw. My daughter. The fever came on so fast. I was taking her to town, but she can't breathe right. Please. Josiah looked at the child. His face went tight. Thera stepped forward. Let me see her. She took the girl from the mother's shaking arms, pressed the back of her hand to the child's forehead. The heat radiated through the skin like a stove lid left too long over the fire. The girl's eyes were half open, unfocused, rolling beneath lids that fluttered like moth wings. How long has she been like this? Since this morning. I tried cold cloths. I tried. Thera looked at Josiah. I need my notebook. He was already moving. Without a word, he ran to the wagon, retrieved the cloth-wrapped bundle from beneath the seat where Thera kept it during the day, brought it back. She opened it, one-handed the child cradled against her with the other arm, and scanned the pages. Her grandmother's handwriting. The careful drawings of leaves and roots. She found what she was looking for. There. She pointed to a stand of narrow-leafed plants growing along the fence line, their small white flowers catching the last of the light. "Yarrow! Bring me a handful. The leaves and flowers both." Josiah gathered the plant. Thera crushed the leaves between her palms, releasing a sharp herbal scent that cut through the evening air. She packed the crushed yarrow into a strip of cloth torn from her hem, folded it into a compress, and pressed it against the child's forehead and chest. "Hold her upright," she told the mother. "It helps the breathing." She worked quickly, calm, her hands steady, her voice low and certain. The same hands that had been bleeding from blisters that morning now moved with the precision of someone who had done this before, who carried the knowledge in her bones the way other people carried prayers. Within 20 minutes, the child's breathing eased. The rattle in her chest softened. The flush began to fade from scarlet to pink. The girl opened her eyes, looked up at Thera, and whimpered once before falling into a real sleep. Not the shallow, gasping unconsciousness of before, but the deep, slow breathing of a body that had decided to fight and was gathering its strength. The mother wept. She clutched Thera's hands and wept and could not stop. "What's your name?" the mother asked. "Thera. Thera Colvin. I'm Mary Carson. This is my Ellie. You saved her. You saved my girl." Thera shook her head. "The yarrow brought the fever down. She'll need rest and plenty of water. Keep her cool through the night. If the fever returns, brew the yarrow into a tea. 1 cup every 4 hours." She gave Mary Carson a handful of the dried plant from her notebook's pages, carefully separated from between the sheets where her grandmother had pressed them decades ago. The mother took them like they were made of gold. Josiah watched from beside the wagon. He did not speak, but the way he looked at Thera had changed. Something new in his eyes. Not just respect. Recognition. The recognition of a man seeing someone clearly for the first time. Not just the woman who cooked his meals and dug beside him in the dirt, but someone with a gift. Someone whose hands held knowledge that could pull a child back from the edge of something terrible. They helped Mary Carson turn her wagon around, watched her drive toward town with the sleeping child in her arms. On the walk home, Josiah was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Your grandmother taught you well." Thera tucked the notebook back inside her coat. "She taught me everything that mattered." That night, the silence between them on the porch felt different again, fuller. The silence of 2 people who had shared something that words could not hold. The ride to town took 2 hours. Thera stayed behind at the dig site, shoveling alone. Her jaw set, her hands wrapped in fresh cloth that was already turning dark with dirt and sweat. Josiah sat slumped in the saddle, his horse plodding along the dusty road. The animal was thin now, ribs showing through its hide like the bars of a cage. It had been a good horse once, strong, fast. Now it was just another thing, dying by inches. The town appeared on the horizon, a cluster of wooden buildings bleached pale by the sun, a church steeple rising above the rest, a water tower that had stood empty for weeks. Josiah tied his horse outside the general store, walked up the steps. His boots sounded hollow on the boards, pushed open the door. The conversation inside stopped. 3 men stood at the counter. Old Henderson, who ran the feed store, a man Josiah had known for 20 years. Young Pete Maslin, whose father owned the livery. And Virgil Skaggs, Harlan Briggs's foreman, a thick-necked man with a scar running down his cheek like a dried riverbed. They all turned to look at Josiah. Westcott. Henderson's voice was cool, distant, like talking to a stranger. Didn't expect to see you in town. Needed supplies. I'll bet you do. Skaggs smiled. It was not a friendly expression. His teeth were yellow, tobacco stained. Hard to keep a ranch running when you're hoarding all the water for yourself. Josiah's jaw tightened. I ain't hoarding anything. That ain't what I heard. Skaggs leaned against the counter, crossing his arms. Word is you're building a dam up there, catching all the runoff before it can reach anyone else's land, keeping it for yourself while the rest of us go thirsty. That ain't true. No. Then what are you doing with all that water? Josiah felt the eyes on him. Henderson, Maslin. The store clerk behind the counter, his hand frozen on a bolt of cloth. Others too, gathering in the doorway, drawn by the sound of raised voices, their faces suspicious, hardened by weeks of drought and fear and the slow erosion of neighborly trust that happens when everyone is desperate and someone whispers that the reason you're suffering is because your neighbor is taking what's yours. The dam is for everyone, he said. When the rains come, the water will collect in the basin. Anyone who needs it can come and take their share. That was always the plan. Sure it was. Skaggs pushed off the counter, walked toward Josiah. His boots were loud on the wooden floor. And I reckon you were fixing to tell everyone about this generous offer. Or were you going to wait until we was all desperate, then charge us for the privilege I wasn't going to charge anyone? Easy to say now. Skaggs was close now. Close enough that Josiah could smell the chewing tobacco on his breath, the sweat in his clothes. But Mr. Briggs tells a different story. Says you've been stealing water that belongs to him. Says you got no right to that land, no right to that dam, no right to any of it. Briggs is a liar. The words came out before Josiah could stop them. The store went silent. Even the flies seemed to hold their breath. Skaggs's expression hardened to stone. His hand moved toward his hip, resting on the butt of his pistol. You want to say that again? Josiah's heart hammered in his chest. His hands were empty. He had left his gun at home. Just like before. He was unarmed, surrounded by men who looked at him like he was something they had scraped off the bottom of their boots. I said Briggs is a liar. His voice did not waver, though his knees felt like water. He wants my land. He's been wanting it for years. This dam business is just an excuse. The dam is theft. Skaggs's fingers curled around his pistol grip. And you know what we do with thieves around here. That's enough. A new voice. Calm. Quiet. But carrying the weight of authority. Josiah turned. Reverend Pardee stood in the doorway of the general store. He was a small man, 70 years old, with white hair thin as corn silk and a face like weathered leather. He had baptized Josiah as an infant, had married Josiah and Luella in the little white church at the edge of town, had spoken the words over their graves while Josiah stood silent, unable to cry. This ain't none of your concern, Preacher Skaggs said. Everything that happens in this town is my concern. Pardee walked into the store. His footsteps were slow but steady, the steps of a man who had walked a long road and was not afraid of what lay ahead. And I reckon I've heard quite enough accusations for one day. Westcott here is a man I've known his entire life. His father before him. His grandfather before that. Pardee stopped beside Josiah, looked up at him with those faded blue eyes that had seen so much, buried so many, and still somehow held a light that refused to go out. I ain't never known a Westcott to steal anything. There will be a town meeting, Pardee said. Sunday after services. Everyone will have a chance to speak their piece, including Josiah, including Mr. Briggs, if he's of a mind to show up. He looked at Skaggs. Tell your employer he's invited. If he's got accusations to make, he can make them to all of us. In public, where we can all hear the truth and judge for ourselves. Skaggs's jaw worked. His hand fell away from his pistol. Mr. Briggs ain't going to be happy about this. Mr. Briggs's happiness ain't my concern. The ride home was longer than the ride in. The sun was setting when he reached the ranch. The sky painted red and orange. Thera was waiting on the porch. She stood when she saw him coming, her face pale in the fading light. Inside, he found the bottle of whiskey in the cabinet above the sink, pulled the cork with his teeth, poured a glass. His hand shook so badly that the whiskey sloshed over the rim, spilling onto the floor. The smell of it rose up sharp and burning. He drank anyway, poured another glass, drank it. The whiskey burned his throat, settled in his empty stomach like fire. He poured a third. Maybe I should just sell. The words came out slurred, bitter, soaked in defeat. Maybe Briggs is right. I can't keep anything alive. Couldn't keep the cattle alive. Couldn't keep. He stopped. His throat closed around the words. Couldn't keep them alive neither. He stared at the whiskey in his glass. His reflection stared back. Distorted. Broken. Luella. Micah. I promised to take care of them. I promised I'd protect them. His voice dropped to a whisper. I break everything I touch. Every single thing. He threw the glass. It shattered against the wall. Whiskey running down the wood like tears. The shards scattered across the floor, catching the lamplight in tiny, sharp stars. Thera did not flinch. She walked toward him, stopped in front of him, looked up at his face with those gray eyes that had seen their own share of darkness and come through it, scarred but standing. You kept your word to me, she said quietly. You gave me a home when no one else would. You treated me with dignity when I had none left. That ain't. You kept your integrity, even when Briggs tried to buy you. Even when his man put his hand on his gun. Her voice was steady, fierce, like a flame that refused to die no matter how hard the wind blew. That is something Briggs can never take from you. That is something he can never buy. She reached up, placed her hand against his cheek. Her palm was warm and rough with calluses. The same calluses she had earned working beside him day after day in the heat and the dust and the dying light. The touch was not romantic. Not exactly. It was something deeper than that. Something more necessary. It was one human being telling another that they were not alone, that they were seen, that they mattered. Then let me help you, she said. That night, they sat on the porch steps. The stars wheeled overhead. The wind moved through the dry grass with a sound like whispering. Josiah told her about the photograph, about the box on the shelf above the fireplace, pinewood with carved flowers and vines, the work of his own hands during those dark weeks after the funeral when his fingers needed something to do, or he would have gone mad. He brought the box out. Opened it. The smell of cedar chips rose up. His fingers found the photograph. A daguerreotype taken by a traveling photographer 6 months before the fever. Luella sat in a chair, hands folded, face serious, the way people got when they had to hold perfectly still. Micah stood beside her, one hand on her knee. He was grinning. He could never hold still. She used to sing while she cooked, Josiah said. Hymns mostly. Sometimes songs from when she was a girl. Micah would sing along even when he didn't know the words. Just make sounds. Follow along as best he could. The fever took her first. 3 days start to finish. I held her hand at the end. She told me to take care of Micah. Made me promise. He laughed, a broken, hollow sound. I promised. And then he got sick too. 4 days I sat with him, bathed his forehead, told him stories, prayed until I lost my voice. His jaw tightened, but it didn't matter. Nothing mattered. The Lord saw fit to take them both. And I've been trying to figure out why ever since. Josiah. Just his name. The first time she had said it without the Mr. in front. I never had anyone to lose, she said. I never had anyone to lose, she said quietly. My parents died when I was 7. Cholera. I don't remember their faces anymore. Just shapes. Shadows. I've spent my whole life alone in other people's houses, wearing other people's cast-offs, invisible to everyone. She paused. The crickets sang their high, steady song. The fire in the stove inside had burned down to nothing, and the cool of the night pressed in around them like something alive. I used to reckon that was the worst kind of pain. Having no one at all. It's not no. She reached over, placed her hand on his. The worst kind is having someone you love with your whole heart, and then losing them. Her touch was warm. Her fingers were rough from work, calloused like his own. 2 pairs of broken hands resting together in the darkness. Josiah did not pull away. Neither did she. They sat like that for a long time. The lamp guttered and dimmed. Outside, the wind died and the night grew still as held breath. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rumbled. Thera lifted her head. Did you hear that? Josiah listened. Another rumble, low and long, rolling across the plains from the west like the voice of something ancient. Storm coming, he said. Rain maybe. They went to the porch railing, stood side by side, looking out at the darkness. The stars had vanished behind a wall of clouds that blotted out the sky. Lightning flickered deep within them, silent and far away. If it rains, Thera began. The dam's not ready. How much more do we need? Another 2 feet. 3 to be safe. The wind picked up. Cool now, carrying the smell of moisture. The first real moisture in months. The scent of rain on the horizon. Of water falling somewhere far away. How long do we have? Thera asked. Josiah watched the lightning, counted the seconds until the thunder reached them. The thunder cracked. Closer now. Much closer. Not long enough, he said. The storm passed in the night without dropping a single drop. Josiah stood on the porch at dawn, watching the clouds retreat toward the east. They had teased and rumbled for hours, lightning dancing across the sky like promises that meant nothing. But in the end, they had given nothing. The ground was as dry as before. The air smelled of dust and something sour, the smell of hope gone stale. Thera came out with 2 cups of coffee, handed him one without speaking. They stood together watching the sun rise over a thirsty land. We need to work faster, Josiah said. I know. They were at the dig site by 7. The dam had taken shape over the weeks, a curved wall of packed earth and stone rising 3 feet above the basin floor. The seep at the far end had strengthened slightly, feeding a shallow pool that glinted in the early light. It was not enough. Not nearly enough. That night, lying in his bed, Josiah heard something that turned his blood to ice. Not horses this time. Torches. He went to the window and saw them. 6 flames moving across the ridge like a procession of ghosts bobbing and weaving through the darkness. Heading toward the dam, Josiah ran. No gun. No weapon. Nothing but his hands and his legs, and the blood hammering in his ears. He reached the dam winded and shaking. 5 men stood at the edge, torches throwing wild shadows. Virgil Skaggs held a pickaxe raised above his head, the blade catching the firelight. Don't. The word tore from his throat. Please don't do this. He spoke to them, to each of them, to Danny, to the young men with grievances of their own against Briggs. He spoke not with threats, but with truth. About the dam, about the water, about what kind of men they wanted to be when they looked in the mirror come morning. Nolan Fetters set down his torch first, his voice quiet but steady. I ain't doing this. I'm sorry, Mr. Skaggs. I just can't. My ma lives in town. She can barely afford water as it is. One by one, the others followed. Torches lowered. Faces turning from firelight into shadow. Skaggs stood alone, the pickaxe trembling in his grip. And then, before he let it fall, he swung it once. Hard. Into the wall of the dam. The blade bit deep into the packed earth. A crack opened. Water began to seep through. Thin, slow, but steady. He dropped the pickaxe, looked at Josiah with something that was not quite hatred and not quite shame. This ain't over, he said. Mr. Briggs won't let it go. Then he turned and walked into the darkness. The others followed, their footsteps fading until there was nothing left but the wind and the sound of water trickling through a wound that had not been there before. Josiah sank to his knees beside the dam, his body shaking. His hands found the crack in the wall. The water seeped through his fingers, cold and steady and relentless. He pressed his palms against the wound as if he could hold it closed by will alone. The moon hung overhead. The dam still stood. But it was bleeding now, and the rain was coming. Sunday morning. The church was full. Josiah sat in the back pew. Thera beside him. Every seat was taken. Folks stood along the walls, crowded into the doorway, spilled out onto the steps. The whole town had come. Farmers in their Sunday best the fabric, stiff and unfamiliar on bodies accustomed to work clothes. Women in calico, dresses their faces drawn and tired from weeks of rationing water that grew scarcer by the day. Children squirming in their seats, too young to understand why their parents looked so worried, but old enough to feel the tension that hummed through the room like a wire pulled taut. The air smelled of candle wax and hair oil and the faint mustiness of hymnals that had been opened and closed 10,000 times. Reverend Pardee stood at the pulpit, his white hair catching the light that streamed through the stained glass windows, red and gold and blue painting patterns on the wooden floor that shifted and moved as the clouds passed overhead. "We are gathered here," he said, "to settle a matter that has divided this community. The matter of Josiah Westcott's dam." A murmur ran through the crowd. Josiah felt the eyes on him. Some curious, some suspicious, some openly hostile. He kept his gaze fixed on the wooden cross behind the pulpit. The wood was old and dark and cracked, and the morning light fell across it in a way that made the cracks look like rivers seen from very far above. Harlan Briggs sat in the front pew, flanked by a man in a city suit, a lawyer by the look of him, with spectacles perched on a narrow nose and a leather case on his lap. Two of Briggs's ranch hands sat on either side, their shoulders wide, their faces blank. Briggs wore his finest clothes, his gold watch chain gleaming against his vest. His face was calm, confident. The face of a man who had already counted the votes and found them in his favor. Mr. Briggs' party said, "You have made accusations against Mr. Westcott. Would you care to speak first?" Briggs rose, walked to the front of the church with the easy stride of a man accustomed to being listened to. He turned to face the congregation, his hands clasped behind his back. "Friends," he said, "I ain't here to make accusations. I'm here to state facts." He delivered his rehearsed warmth to the congregation. "Josiah Westcott has built a dam on his property, a dam that captures water that would otherwise flow onto my land, water that my cattle need to survive." He paused, letting the words sink into the silence like stones dropped into a pond. "Now I ain't an unreasonable man. I offered to buy Mr. Westcott's property at a fair price. More than fair, truth be told. $3,000 for a ranch that ain't worth half that in its current condition." But he refused. Briggs shook his head, slowly, sadly, the way a man shakes his head when he is performing disappointment for an audience. "I don't understand why. His ranch is failing. His cattle are dying. He's got debts he can't pay and land that won't produce. What does he stand to gain by holding on to something that's already lost?" He let the question hang. And Josiah watched the faces in the congregation, watched Henderson from the feed store nodding slowly, watched two farmers exchange glances that said, "He's got a point." Watched the doubt spread through the room like smoke under a closed door. Briggs spoke the language of reason and numbers, and in a room full of desperate people, his words landed with the weight of truth, even when the truth they carried was only half complete. "Maybe he's got something you don't understand," a voice called out. Something called pride. Heads turned. Old Odessa Pruitt, 80 years old, bent over her cane like a question mark. She had risen from her seat, and the effort of standing was visible in the trembling of her arms and the whiteness of her knuckles against the dark wood of the cane. But her voice was steady, thin as wire, and twice as strong. "I remember your father, Harlan Briggs. He came to this valley with nothing but the clothes on his back and a hungry look in his eye. My husband gave him his first job, fed him at our table, treated him like kin when he had no kin of his own." Her eyes were hard as flint. They caught the colored light from the stained glass and held it without warmth. "He would be ashamed to see what you've become." Briggs's expression flickered, the composure cracking for just a heartbeat before he caught it and pressed it back into place. "Mrs. Pruitt, I don't reckon. I ain't finished." She pointed her cane at him. The tip trembled, but the aim was true. "I also remember Josiah Westcott's father. He dug the first well in this town with his own 2 hands, gave water to anyone who needed it, never asked for a penny in return." She turned to look at Josiah, and her expression softened. "Just a fraction. Just enough. His son is the same kind of man." Another voice rose. Tom Hadley, standing near the window, his hat in his hands, turning it around and around by the brim. Josiah helped me bury my wife, he said. Dug the grave himself when I was too weak to lift a shovel. Didn't ask for nothing in return. He fixed my wagon last spring, Marcus Webb added from the back. Wouldn't take payment. Said neighbors help neighbors. He brought food to my family when we had nothing. This from a woman Josiah barely knew. The wife of a sharecropper who had moved away months ago. She stood in the doorway, a child on her hip, her dress patched at the elbows. One by one they spoke. Stories Josiah had forgotten. Small kindnesses he had done without thinking, without expecting anything back. A lifetime of quiet decency laid out before the congregation like evidence at a trial he had not known he was standing in. Briggs's face grew tight. The warmth vanished from his expression like heat leaving a stone after sunset. This is all real touching, he said, his voice harder now. But it don't change the facts. The dam is stealing water that rightfully belongs to. The dam is for everyone. Thera's voice. Josiah turned. She had risen from the pew. Her hands trembled at her sides. Her knuckles were white, but her chin was lifted and her eyes were clear, and she was looking at the congregation with an expression he had never seen on her face before. The surrender of a woman who had spent her entire life building walls to keep people out, and who was now tearing those walls down with her own hands because someone mattered more than fear. I've been at that ranch for weeks now, she said, her voice carried to every corner of the church, steady, clear. The voice of a woman who had decided what she was going to say and was going to say it regardless of what it cost her. I've worked beside Mr. Westcott every day. I've seen what he's building with my own eyes. She looked around at the assembled faces. The dam ain't for him alone. It's for all of you. When the rains come, the basin will fill. There'll be enough water for every farm in this valley. And why should we believe you? Briggs's voice was cold now, stripped of all pretense. You're just a what? Thera stepped into the aisle. The light from the stained glass windows fell across her face. Red and gold and blue, the colors of something holy painted across the features of a woman who had never felt holy in her life. A mail-order bride. A woman with nothing. Someone you'd throw away like yesterday's newspaper. The church went silent. Even the children stopped squirming. Even the flies stopped buzzing against the windows. The silence was so complete that Josiah could hear the candle flames breathing on the altar. I know what I am, Thera said. I know what folks think of me. She did not look away from Briggs, but her words were for everyone. For the women who had whispered about her at the general store. For every person who had looked at her and seen nothing worth looking at. But I also know what I've seen. Josiah Westcott ain't no thief. He ain't no liar. He's a man who lost everything he loved and still chose to help others instead of giving up. Her voice cracked, just slightly, like a hairline fracture in glass. She steadied it. That's more than some people in this room can say. Her eyes found Briggs, held him there in the colored light. He looked away first. Reverend Pardee cleared his throat. I believe we've heard enough. All those who believe Mr. Westcott ought to be allowed to keep his dam, please rise. The sound of scraping wood filled the church. One person, then 5, then 20. The pews emptied row by row as people stood. Tom Hadley, Marcus Webb, the woman with the child on her hip. Old Henderson from the feed store who had been nodding along with Briggs not 10 minutes ago, rose slowly from his seat with the expression of a man who had just remembered something important about himself. But not everyone stood. 3 farmers near the back remained seated, their eyes on the floor, their hands in their laps. A rancher from the far edge of the county who owed Briggs money stayed down. His wife beside him, her face tight with shame. They were afraid. And Josiah understood their fear because he had tasted it himself. The vote was not unanimous. The victory was not clean. But it was enough. Briggs stood. His face was pale beneath the flush of anger. His jaw worked, but no words came out. His lawyer leaned toward him and whispered something. Briggs shook his head once, sharp. Then he walked down the aisle. The crowd parted to let him pass. His boots sounded loud on the wooden floor in the silence. At the door, he paused, looked back at Josiah. Something passed between them. Not hatred exactly, not respect either. Something else entirely. The recognition of a man looking at the thing he feared most in this world, which was not Josiah Westcott, but the version of himself that Josiah Westcott represented. The man who had nothing and would not break. Then he was gone. After the service, folks gathered in the churchyard under the old oak trees. They came to Josiah one by one, shaking his hand, clapping his shoulder, offering help with the dam. Men who had avoided him for months now spoke to him like neighbors again. Women pressed jars of preserves and wrapped bundles of food into his hands. Mrs. Lenora Cask found Thera by the churchyard fence. She stood there for a moment, her mouth working like she was chewing on something she did not want to swallow. "That child you tended to," she said finally. "The Carson girl. She's better. Her mother wanted you to know." She nodded once, then walked away. It was not an apology, but it was an acknowledgement, and from Lenora Cask, that was as close to grace as anyone was likely to get. They came at dawn the next morning. Wagons appeared on the horizon one after another, kicking up dust against the gray sky. Tom Hadley was first, his wagon loaded with shovels and pickaxes and wooden planks. His 2 sons sat beside him, young men with strong backs and calloused hands. Behind him came Marcus Webb with a cartload of stones. Then the Henderson boys with their mule team. Then families Josiah barely knew. By the time the sun cleared the horizon, 30 people had gathered in his yard. Reverend Pardee arrived last, his old mare plodding along the road. He dismounted slowly, his joints stiff, his white hair ruffling in the wind. "Well," he said, looking at the crowd, "what are we all standing around for?" The work began. They split into teams, half on the walls, half on the spillway. They repaired the crack Skaggs had made, filling it with stone, and packed clay until the seep stopped and the wall held solid again. Then they built it higher, foot by foot, stone by stone. The dam rose under 30 pairs of hands in a single day, more than Josiah and Thera had managed in weeks. The women set up a station beneath the oak tree. Tables appeared from somewhere. Planks laid across sawhorses covered with white cloths. Plates of biscuits piled high. Jars of preserves with handwritten labels. A massive pot of beans hanging over a fire pit, the smell of molasses and salt pork rising on the breeze. Coffee pouring from a blackened kettle strong enough to stand a spoon in. Old Odessa Pruitt directed the operation from a chair someone had carried out for her, her cane tapping the ground whenever anyone moved too slow. Josiah paused midday, sat beneath the oak tree, his arms aching, his back screaming. Thera appeared with a plate, biscuits and beans, a slice of apple pie someone had brought. She sat beside him without speaking. Around them, the sounds of work continued. Picks striking earth, shovels scraping stone, men calling to each other across the site. "I forgot," Josiah said. His voice was rough. "I forgot what it felt like to be part of something bigger than myself." Thera's hand found his. Her fingers were rough and warm. "You remembered," she said. "That's what matters." By late afternoon, the dam was finished. The walls stood 4 feet high, packed tight with earth and stone. The spillway cut a clean channel through the eastern bank. The basin lay ready waiting. And then the rain came. Not gently, not gradually. The sky opened like a wound, and the water fell in sheets so thick Josiah could not see his own hand in front of his face. The families scattered to their wagons. Hands waved from under canvas covers. Voices called out farewells that were swallowed by the storm. Josiah and Thera stood at the edge of the dam, watching the basin fill. The water rose slowly at first, 1 inch, then 2, then 3. The spillway began to trickle, then to flow, and then from somewhere to the south above, the roar of the rain and the crack of the thunder, another sound, lowing, desperate and high-pitched, the sound of animals in terror. Josiah turned, listened. His stomach dropped. The cattle, the creek bed, the one that had been dry since June. It was not dry anymore. The rain was pouring off the hills and into the creek channel in a torrent of brown water that had nowhere to go but straight through the low ground where the last 8 head of his cattle had been grazing. He ran. The rain hammered his face and shoulders. The ground had turned to mud in minutes, sucking at his boots with every step. He reached the ridge and looked down. The creek bed was a river now. 4 feet of churning brown water carrying branches and rocks and debris roaring through the channel with a sound like a freight train. And there, pressed against the far bank where the land rose sharply into a wall of rock, 8 cows huddled together, the water already up to their bellies, rising fast. He looked back toward the dam. Through the curtain of rain he could see the south wall, the section where Skaggs had driven his pickaxe. The repair was holding, but the volume of water pouring into the basin was more than anyone had planned for. The wall was seeping, the packed clay darkening with moisture as the pressure built. If the south wall gave way, the entire basin would empty. Weeks of work, the labor of 30 people, the water that would keep this valley alive, all of it gone in minutes. And the cattle, the last 8 head, everything he had left, drowning in a creek bed that had been dust 12 hours ago. He could not do both. The realization hit him like a physical blow, knocked the breath from his lungs. He stood on the ridge in the driving rainwater streaming down his face, and he understood with perfect clarity that in the next 60 seconds he was going to lose something. The only question was what? Josiah. Thera was beside him, soaked through, her dress plastered to her body, her hair hanging in ropes around her face. She had seen the dam. She had seen the cattle. She had done the same calculation in her head and arrived at the same answer. "Go," she said. "Get the cattle out. I'll hold the dam. You can't hold it alone. I'll hold it." Their eyes met. Rain ran between them in silver streams. Lightning split the sky, and in the flash he saw her face clearly. The set of her jaw, the steadiness in her eyes, the absolute refusal to let this be the thing that broke them. He ran for the cattle. The water in the creek bed was up to his thighs when he reached the bottom. Cold, shockingly cold after months of heat. The current pulled at his legs, trying to drag him downstream. He braced himself against a boulder, found his footing, pushed forward. The cattle were wild with fear, eyes rolling white. He grabbed the nearest one by the horns, pulled, shouted, drove it toward the bank where the slope was gentlest. It fought him, nearly pulled him under. He held on. The mud sucked at his boots. His grip slipped on the wet horns, and he went down on one knee in the churning water. "Get up!" The voice in his head was his own, but it sounded like his father's. "Get up and finish this." He got up. He finished it, one cow at a time, dragging them, pushing them, screaming at them through the roar of the water and the crack of the thunder. 8 animals, 8 trips through the rising flood. By the time he pulled the last one up the bank, his arms were shaking so badly he could barely close his fists. He turned back toward the dam, started running. His legs were water. His lungs were fire. The rain had not let up. If anything, it was falling harder now, the drops so thick and heavy they stung his skin like gravel. He crested the ridge and saw Thera. She was on her knees at the south wall, her hands buried in the packed earth up to her wrists. She had torn stones from the ground around her and pressed them into the seeping crack. Mud and clay packed over the stones with her bare hands. Her fingers were bleeding. He could see the red even through the rain, diluted to pink as it ran down her wrists and disappeared into the mud. Beside her, on the ground, face down in a puddle of brown water, was her grandmother's notebook. It had fallen from inside her coat where she always kept it. The leather cover was soaked through, the pages swelling with water, the ink beginning to run the careful drawings of plants and the recipes for remedies dissolving into pale blue ghosts of themselves. Thera saw it. He watched her see it, watched her eyes go to the notebook and then back to the wall where the water was pressing through with increasing urgency. Watched the choice cross her face like a shadow. She did not pick up the notebook. She turned back to the wall, drove her hands deeper into the mud, pressed her body against the packed earth as if she could hold back the entire weight of the water with nothing but bone and will. The wall held. Josiah reached her, dropped to his knees beside her. Together they packed mud and stone into the weakening section until the seep slowed, then stopped, then held. The rain continued to fall, but the wall did not give. The basin filled. The spillway channeled the overflow east away from the valley, just as they had planned. When it was over, when the rain finally began to ease and the thunder rolled away to the east like a retreating army, Josiah looked at Thera. She was still on her knees, her hands buried in the mud, her chest heaving, her eyes fixed on the spot a few feet away where the notebook lay in the puddle, its pages splayed open like the wings of a drowned bird. She did not move toward it. Josiah reached over, picked up the notebook. The leather was heavy with water. The pages stuck together. Some of the ink had survived. Some had not. He could see the faint outlines of her grandmother's drawings, the careful handwriting that had guided Thera through a life of knowing how to heal what was broken. He held it out to her. She took it, held it against her chest. The water from the notebook soaked into her already soaked dress, and she did not care. Her chin trembled. Her eyes filled. And then, for the first time since he had known her, Thera Colvin did something she had not allowed herself to do in front of another human being in as long as she could remember. She let him see her cry, not a single tear sliding elegantly down her cheek, not a quiet, dignified weeping, but the real thing, the deep, shuddering sobs of a woman who had lost the last physical connection to the only person who had ever loved her unconditionally and who had chosen to let it go because someone else mattered more. Josiah did not speak. He did not offer comfort or platitudes or empty promises that everything would be all right. He simply sat down beside her in the mud and the rain, and he put his arm around her shoulders, and he held her while she wept. And she let him. That was the thing that mattered. She let him hold her. She did not pull away. She did not stiffen or shrink or build the wall back up. She leaned into him and let him take some of the weight, and in the letting, she broke something open in herself that had been locked shut for 30 years. The rain slowed to a drizzle, then stopped. The clouds thinned, and a single ray of late afternoon sun broke through, catching the surface of the basin. The water shone, 3 feet deep and rising, clear at the edges where the sediment had settled, alive with the reflected light of a sky that was, for the first time in months, not entirely white. They sat there until the shaking stopped, until the tears dried, until the only sound was the dripping of water from the edges of the dam and the slow, steady breathing of 2 people who had lost something and gained something, and were not yet sure which weighed more. The morning after the storm, the world looked like it had been washed and hung out to dry. Josiah stood on the porch with a cup of coffee growing cold in his hands. The sky was blue, not the bleached white it had been for months, but actual blue, deep and clear and stretching from horizon to horizon like a promise somebody had finally decided to keep. The air smelled of wet earth and green things stirring underground, of life remembering how to begin. The cattle stood at the edge of the basin drinking, all 8 of them, thin and ragged and alive. The water was 3 feet deep, clear and cool, catching the early light and ripples that moved across the surface like something breathing. 2 neighbors had already come with barrels in their wagons. They filled them quietly, nodding to Josiah as they worked. Nobody said much. Nobody needed to. The water was there. The dam held. That was enough. But Josiah was not watching the basin. He was watching the trail that led down to the creek bed, the one that had been a river 12 hours ago and was now a muddy channel littered with branches and stones and the debris of a storm that had nearly taken everything. He set down his coffee, walked off the porch, followed the trail. The creek bed was still wet. His boots sank into the soft earth with each step, leaving prints that filled with brown water behind him. The smell of mud and mineral and wet stone rose up around him. He moved downstream, scanning the banks, the rocks, the tangles of brush that the flood had pushed against the boulders. He almost missed it. A flash of dark leather caught in the roots of a cottonwood tree that had been half uprooted by the flood. The tree leaned at an angle over the creek bed, its root ball exposed like a clenched fist, and there wedged between 2 thick roots, about 3 feet off the ground, was the notebook. Josiah knelt, worked it free carefully. The leather cover was swollen with water-stained dark, the stitching along the spine pulling loose. He opened it. Some pages were stuck together so tightly they would tear if separated. Others had come loose entirely, the edges curled and soft. The ink had run on many pages, dissolving into pale blue shadows on the yellowed paper. But not all of it was lost. He could see drawings that had survived. A plant with narrow leaves and small flowers, labeled in a hand that was not Thera's. Yarrow, Another page with a recipe for something involving honey and dried root, the measurements still legible. A third page where the ink had held almost perfectly a detailed illustration of a flowering herb with notes written in the margins in handwriting so small and precise it must have taken hours. He closed the notebook, held it against his chest the way he had seen Thera hold it on the platform at the railway station. Then he carried it home. He found a stretch of railing on the porch where the morning sun fell warm and steady. He opened the notebook and laid it there, spreading the pages carefully, one by one, the way you might spread the feathers of a wounded bird to check for breaks. Some pages he separated with the edge of his pocket knife, working the blade between the stuck sheets with the patience of a man who understood that some things cannot be rushed without being ruined. Others he simply laid flat and let the sun do its work. 43 pages. He counted them as he worked. 43 pages of a dead woman's knowledge saved from the flood by the roots of a tree and the stubbornness of leather stitching that had held when everything else let go. He was still working when the screen door opened behind him. Thera stepped onto the porch. Her hair was down, still damp from washing. Her face was pale. Her eyes were swollen from the crying she had done the night before, the kind of crying that leaves marks the way storms leave marks on the land. She looked at Josiah, looked past him, saw the pages spread across the railing in the morning light, the drawings, the handwriting, the pale blue ghosts of remedies that had been washing away in a puddle 12 hours ago. Her hand went to her mouth. Josiah did not look up from the page he was separating. Found it downstream, he said. His voice was quiet. Caught in a cottonwood root. The water got to some of the pages pretty bad, but not all of them. He laid the last page flat, smoothed it gently with his fingertips. The ones that are gone, you can write them again. You remember them. I've seen you work. You know every plant in that book by heart. You know what your grandmother knew because she taught you, and you listened and you kept it. The book is just paper and ink. What's in your head and your hands is what matters. He looked up at her then. She was standing very still, her hand still pressed against her mouth, her eyes wet. But she was not crying the way she had cried the night before. This was different. This was the quiet overwhelming of a person who has spent a lifetime believing that nothing they owned or were or carried was worth the effort of saving, and who has just discovered that someone went out at dawn and walked a muddy creek bed to prove them wrong. You went looking for it, she said. Her voice was barely a whisper. Yes. Why? Because it's yours. 3 words. He said them simply, without weight, without performance. The way a man states a fact so plain it does not need decorating. The sky is blue. Water is wet. This is yours. And in those 3 words was everything he could not say and did not need to, because the saying would have made it smaller than it was. Thera walked to the railing, touched one of the pages with her fingertip. The paper was still damp, soft as cloth. The drawing of the yarrow plant faded but visible. Her grandmother's handwriting. The last thread connecting her to the woman who had taken in a 7-year-old orphan and taught her that she was worth something. She had let it go in the rain. She had watched it fall, and she had chosen the dam. And in that choosing, she had believed it was gone forever. But he had gone looking for it. Before coffee. Before sunrise. Before she was even awake. She sat down on the top step of the porch. The wood was warm from the sun. She held the notebook in her lap, closed the leather dark and swollen but whole. She pressed her palms flat against the cover the way she had held it on the platform at the railway station the day they met. The same gesture, the same need, but different now. Because now she was not holding it to keep the world out. She was holding it because someone had given it back to her. And receiving did not make her weak. It made her seen. That evening the rain came again. Gentle this time. A soft, steady drizzle that tapped against the roof. They stood on the porch. The basin glinted in the distance, full and silver in the fading light. "I don't want to leave," Thera said. Her voice was barely audible above the rain. Josiah turned to look at her. "I know the arrangement was supposed to be temporary. I know I was just meant to be the housekeeper. But stay." The word came out before he could think, before he could doubt, before the fear could stop him. "Stay," he said again. "Not as the housekeeper, not as anything you were before." He turned to face her fully. His hands trembled as he reached for hers. "Stay as whatever you want to be, whatever we become together." Her eyes searched his face, looking for the lie, the trap, the hidden cruelty. The same search she had conducted on the platform at the railway station when a stranger offered her a job she did not trust. She had looked for the worst in him then, because the worst was all she had ever known. She did not find it then. She did not find it now. "Are you sure?" she whispered. He reached into his pocket. His fingers found the small object he had placed there that morning. A silver ring. Simple and plain. It had belonged to his mother. He had not known why he put it there when he dressed. Not until this moment. He held it up. The metal caught the last light of the day. "I'm sure." Thera looked at the ring, at his face, at the ring again. "Yes," she said. He slid the ring onto her finger. It fit like it had been made for her, like it had been waiting all those years in the carved pinewood box on the shelf above the fireplace for the hand it was meant to find. He pulled her close, felt the warmth of her body against his, smelled the rain in her hair and the faint ghost of lavender from the notebook she still carried inside her coat. Their foreheads touched. "We should go inside," she said, "before we catch our death." In a minute, he was not ready to let go. The rain on the roof, the woman in his arms, the water in the basin and the cattle on the hill and the green things stirring underground. "In a minute," he said again. 1 year later. The basin held. The water stood clear and cool through the autumn and into the winter, and when the spring rains came, it filled again deeper than before. The cattle grew fat. The grass came back spreading across the hills like a second chance written in a language the land had almost forgotten. Josiah and Thera were married in the little white church at the edge of town on a Sunday morning in October when the leaves were turning gold. Reverend Pardee performed the ceremony. The whole town attended. Old Odessa Pruitt cried into her handkerchief and pretended she had dust in her eye. They planted a garden in the spring, built a new room onto the house come summer, sat together on the porch in the evenings watching the sun set over land that was green again. 2 rocking chairs now, side by side. The wood of the new one still pale and unweathered beside the old one that had sat alone for so long. Sometimes late at night, Josiah still walked out to the 2 graves on the hillside. He would stand there in the darkness, hat in his hands, talking to Luella and Micah, telling them about the ranch, about the garden, about Thera, about the notebook she was rewriting from memory, her handwriting alongside her grandmother's 2 generations of knowledge, side by side on paper that smelled of cottonwood root and survival. He liked to think they approved, and always when he returned to the house, the book lay open in the old armchair. Past page 47 for the first time in 4 years. One evening in September, as the fireflies rose from the grass and the stars emerged one by one, Thera came to stand beside him at the graves. She slipped her hand into his, said nothing. They stood together in the darkness, the 2 of them and the 2 who had come before, and the silence between the living and the dead was not empty. It was full. They walked back to the house together. On the porch, Thera paused. She placed her hand over her belly, looked up at him with something new in her eyes, something tender and frightened and hopeful all at once. The way the sky looks just before dawn when the darkness is still there but the light is coming and you can feel it even before you can see it. "Josiah," she said, "I've been meaning to tell you something." He looked at her hand, at her face, at the tears gathering in the corners of her eyes, and he understood. He pulled her close, held her tight, felt her heart beating against his chest. 2 hearts, and somewhere between them, so new it was barely a whisper, a third. "Thank you," he whispered into her hair. "Thank you," the crickets sang. The wind moved through the grass. Somewhere in the darkness, a mockingbird called out, 3 notes rising, like a question finally answered. Josiah held his wife and looked past her into the house, at the kitchen that smelled of cornbread and coffee, at the shelf where the carved pinewood box sat empty now because the photograph of Luella and Micah hung on the wall beside the door, where he could see it every time he walked in and every time he walked out. At the notebook on the counter, open to a page where 2 sets of handwriting lived side by side. And then he did something he had been thinking about all day, but had not told her. He released her gently, walked to the corner of the porch where the small chair had sat for 4 years. Micah's chair, the wood gray with weather, the seat worn smooth by a boy who had never sat still. He picked it up, carried it through the front door, set it at the kitchen table, in the place where a child would sit, where a new voice would learn to say bang bang pow and ask for biscuits and sing along to songs without knowing the words. Thera stood in the doorway, watching, her hand still resting on her belly, her eyes bright. She did not speak. She did not need to. The chair said everything. It said that the past was not being replaced. It was being continued. That love does not end when the people who carried it are gone. It finds new hands to hold it, new voices to sing the songs, new lives to fill the chairs that grief had emptied. She walked to the stove, began making cornbread, round, the way her mother had taught her, the way Luella had made it, the way she would teach the child who was coming, the same shape, the same recipe, passed from hand to hand across the years like a letter that keeps finding its way home. The night was quiet. The stars were out. The basin shone in the moonlight like a silver coin laid on the dark earth. And the house on the hill with 2 rocking chairs on the porch, and a small chair at the kitchen table, and a notebook drying on the railing with 2 sets of handwriting inside, was no longer a place where a man went to be alone with his grief. It was a home. If you have listened this far, dear friend, I thank you kindly. This story was not written for critics or scholars. It was written for you, the one who knows that love is not always thunder and lightning, but sometimes just 2 weary souls choosing each other day after day through drought and storm and silence. I hope their story reminded you of something good, something true, something worth holding on to. Until we meet again on another page, dear friend.